Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming. Welcome to our event, Bees Beyond Honey, Understanding Native and Managed Pollinators. I'm your host, Sarah Ressing. I'm Wild One's Education and Program Coordinator, and I am thrilled to have three pollinator experts joining us. We have USGS wildlife biologist, Sam Droege. We have Crown Bees founder, Dave Hunter, and Associate Director of the Pollinator Partnership, Lora Morandin. I think these folks are the bee's knees, and you'll hear more from them in just a bit. But before I jump in, a few notes. This webinar is hosted on YouTube Live, so feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. If you'd like to hide the chat, you can enter full screen mode. Closed captioning is available in your settings, and you can pause or rewind using the controls at the bottom of the player. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more great content. Programs like this one would not be possible without generous support from all of you, so please consider donating to Wild Ones today. Wild One's vision is native plants and natural landscapes in every community, and your donation will help us reach that goal. And beyond donations, there are so many ways you can contribute to our mission. You can volunteer at the local or national level, certify your habitat, or dive into our reading lists. Every action makes a difference in creating a healthy planet. Visit wildones.org to learn more and get involved. Now, finally, welcome again to Bees Beyond Honey, Understanding Native and Managed Pollinators. Our goal is to explore the critical roles that native bees, solitary managed bees, and honeybees all play in our ecosystems, and to discuss how we can support all pollinators in a balanced and evidence-based way. We will begin today with a short educational presentation from each of our panelists, and then we'll move into a discussion where our experts will explore key issues related to responsible pollinator management. As a community, Wild Ones values inclusivity and respect, so tonight's conversation is an opportunity to broaden our understanding and bridge gaps between different approaches to pollinator conservation. Thank you again for joining us, and I am delighted to introduce our first speaker. Sam Droege is a wildlife biologist at the U.S. Geological Survey's Eastern Ecological Science Center. Sam is a leading voice in native bee conservation and the head of the Native Bee Inventory and Monitoring Program. In his distinguished career, he has developed numerous community science programs, including Frogwatch USA. His current work focuses on developing both large and small-scale surveys for native bees while creating extensive photographic documentation of bee species. The USGS Bee Inventory and Monitoring Lab's Flickr archive now includes over 5,000 ultra-high-resolution public domain images, which Sam and his team use to develop identification tools and keys for native bee species. Welcome, Sam.
So I want to talk, I have little time, big picture. Here's a shot of part of North America. And what I want to show is, and talk about, is that there are 4,000 different species of native bees in North America, many who do not have names. So we're estimating that 4,000. And they're responding to large patterns. So they are dividing up this entire region into subsets. And so many of the species are only located in a small part of the continent. So we have a bunch that are located only in the eastern forest, things on the Florida Peninsula, things that run down the barrier islands on the east coast, a few sand dune specialists even in the west coast. We have prairie elements, we have boreal elements, and we have the mountain areas, the intermountain areas, and then finally we have the deserts of the Southwest. So if we look at species totals, most of the East, we're roughly around, let's say, 400 species. A lot. East of the Mississippi, that conglomerate is about 700 species, a little bit more. You really get into the diversity down here. So these four Mexican border states, Mexico, outrageous biodiversity, but these 4,000 species each or more in those states. And then in the upper parts, we get down to probably like the 500-600 range still too. So each of these species has a very specific set of flowers. We'll talk about that in a second, but it's a highly specialized system. I need to bring up honeybees because everyone knows honeybees, and the short part of this is whatever you know about honeybees, that does not occur and work as a natural history element in our native species. So you may have to forget everything you know about bees, but if it's occurring in honeybees, it's not occurring in our native species. They're magical in their own way, but not a good model for what we're talking about. So now I just want to talk about what you can do in a really brief sort of way. Native plants, most of these bee species have a tight relationship with native plants. Non-native plants can have bees on them, but it's like bird feeders have birds on them. Those are not supporting the bees. We're an interesting conservation plan. So first element, look at your region, bring in native plants. As long as they're blooming, you're good enough. You're 80% of a good job. The more diverse those plants, the more bees are brought in, because many of those bees have a very short list of plants that are appropriate, and each plant has a relatively short list of bees that are doing the pollination on that plant. Different colors are there for a reason in flowers. So each of these different colors is attracting a different set of bees. So another way to bring in different populations of bees without knowing anything about bees, bring in different colors of flowers. How nice is that? Different colors of flowers. You would want that anyway. Then we have different shapes. All the shapes of flowers that you see, those are designed not by people in florist shops, but they're designed by nature, and they're really being designed by a dance between bees and plants. So each of these very different shapes has access to a very different set of groups and is trying to exclude other species of insects and bees that are not going to do pollination for them. So different shapes in your garden. Very good. Time of year, many, if not most of the bee species, most probably, are out for only a limited part of the entire growing season. They're out when their plants are blooming. Why be out the rest of the year? So the rest of the year, their young are in nests waiting for the subsequent year. So bloom throughout the year in your garden or your landscape or your property is another objective you can aim for without worrying about all the lovely species level interactions that we love to do, but is kind of overwhelming sometimes. Bees, as mentioned, very picky. Here's a website put together by Jared Fowler with 3 regions, Eastern, Central, and Western, that illuminates the bees that are the most specialized. In other words, by specialized, we're talking about that are only gathering pollen from a particular family, genus, or species sometimes of plant. And by planting those as your first cut, you're lifting a lot of the conservation species, the species that are the least common, because many of the, if not most, of the least common bees are the highly specialized bees. So by emphasizing those, many of which are common general, like you can see at the top there, helianthus, sunflowers, willow, those kinds of things. So they're not necessarily something that are going to be hard to find, but planting those is a good strategy. This is something that, when you think about it, that was at some point, dial it back 200 years, that was good native habitat. That is zero. Your house is zero. Sadly, your deck is zero. All these kinds of places have taken away habitat. This is the primary you're looking at, the reason for decline. So bring just a very general strategy. We can go into this more. As if you can push as much of that turf away and into gardens like this, that's better. Keep the area that are paths, that are human presentations, the front, the driveway, all those kinds of spots need to be, shown that you're maintaining them, and then you're given a pass on all the remaining areas. This is my house, and it's not for everybody, but it gives you a sense that you can do an awful lot and still maintain sort of the cultural environment at the same time. Another shot of my house, I'm using a weed whacker to put in paths, to edit the plants, and I'm constantly pulling out plants, putting in new ones, reshaping this environment over and over. Here's an example of how easy it can be done in extreme environments. To the left, a gravel parking lot. The area to the right with the flowers, that was a gravel parking lot. We just rototilled it, not just left all the weeds as is, just to, sort of set them back a little. And then we didn't use cardboard, didn't use anything other than arborist chips. So right off the chip truck from, people chipping up trees in people's yards. And they're dropping it in there at about 8 inches to 12 inches deep. And we plant right in it, plant it that day. And we don't water it. We weed it once a year. So you can do a lot. I should also mention, these are really thuggy native plants. So you want to look for broad-shouldered native plants in some of these kinds of environments, so you're not going to spend a lot of time. I'll end there. I just want to emphasize, too, that sometimes, and many times, if you want to look at what is the one thing I can do that will provide the most usefulness to the environment for bees now. It's on your landscape or through a municipality, county, your neighbors, your neighborhood, your HOA, is stop mowing everything, right? So yes, you can plant pollinator gardens, but look at your roadsides. Why are they mowing all the way back? Look at underneath your power lines. Why are those mown several times during the year? The shortcut without a lot of time, and this is the last thing I'll say, is think about the environment that you own, maintain, control, or have access to, and think about why is it being mown in the summer during the growing season? Why not mow it one time in the winter and you don't even have to do anything. You can walk away and it will be of great benefit to the environment immediately. So there's your easy, fast, high impact lift that isn't super sophisticated, but it's something that a lot of us can do almost immediately. That's all I have.
Thank you, Sam. As always, a lot of resources shared there, which I really appreciate, and I'm sure the folks watching do as well. What I'm also hearing is that like you really like weed whackers are one of your favorite tools. Like before we started, you're using it to make seed, make paths. What else could you do with that?
Yeah, I don't have my I don't have a lawnmower anymore. Well, a good weed whacker is so I've actually graduated mostly to using battery operated ones now. I didn't think they were very powerful, but now I do. I have brush blades on them. So a weed whacker strategy is, yes, I need a string trim to trim the grass down to basically make my small amounts of lawn. I don't use a lawnmower at all. I now use, again, like I mentioned, a battery powered one. But a lot of times at the end of the year, I have a lot of growth, and I'm a naturalized, nature first kind of landscape. So there are woody plants and all kinds of weeds in there that I really am not interested in maintaining and aren't going to just be sitting there going away if I wait. So at the end of the year, I come in and I'm actually doing it periodically during the year, and I'm like editing out the plants that I don't want to see anymore that year. So I'm not trying to dig them out. So for example, blackberry, mugwort, a lot of these other kinds of things, I'm just repressing them. I want to shift the balance to a natural landscape, but I don't have that much time, and I'm not everything has to be neat and tidy in little tiny balls in a pile of mulch. I want that wildness because I have all kinds of cool things. Like my list of snakes in my yard is just huge. Not, of course, something that a lot of people want to achieve necessarily, but I want my yard, particularly the edges, to merge with the natural environment. I don't want just a pollinator garden parked in the middle of my lawn, isolated. I want it to be functional, like I'm giving back. Like it was a really repressed landscape, acre of grass when I got it. Now it's basically, I have a house in the middle of even better landscape because a lot of the surrounding area is high invasive. So I can come in. The brush blade is basically a rotating saw, let's call it. There's lots of different things about it. And so you can take out fairly large diameter woody plants. And if you're doing it once a year, then you won't have a problem using that to take care of any incursions by the red maples, the sumacs, and you can edit your landscape.
Thank you so much, Sam. Now I'd like to introduce Dave Hunter. He is the founder and owner of Crown Bees, a company dedicated to promoting sustainable pollination through the use of solitary bees. With over 2 decades of experience, Dave has collaborated with researchers and industry peers to develop ethical and efficient practices for integrating mason bees into agriculture and home gardening. Known for his approach of thinking like a bee, Dave is passionate about bridging knowledge gaps and ensuring that everyone can contribute to pollinator conservation.
Thanks, Sarah. I appreciate the introduction. So I started just 30 years ago, long time ago. My wife comes home from an aerobics class. She said, man, I was over at someone's house and they had thousands of apples on their trees, same size as ours. And we had none, couple. So go find out what was happening over there. And she went over there. She said, they have something called a mason bee. Well, what's that? And 30 years ago, I went out and found some type of a bee house. I put that out there. And within just a few years, we then had thousands of apples on our tree. And, I've learned since then that the bees were there just missing in my yard. And since then, God, we've helped push or bring in cavity nesting bees into agriculture. We're now seeing where obviously the honeybee is way out there. We're now seeing farmlands bringing in cute little bees that just very different than a honeybee, belly flopping into a flower, next flower, belly flopping that flower, and the pollen just spreads. So the mason bees is now starting to get into cherries. You can double your yield, almonds 35%, 40% more strawberries, etc. That's all science. And then on the leaf cutters, been since the 50s, the leaf cutter, the alfalfa leaf cutter bee, is used extensively for the alfalfa industry. And maybe 8 or 9 years ago, we said, hey, how can we help backyard gardeners also try this bee out? So these bees are established and managed. For the food consumption is important to us. Now, what I appreciate about Sam, oh my gosh, there's a lot of bees out there across North America, roughly 4,000. And depending on where you live, roughly 20 to 25% of these bees nest in cavities. Okay, so cavity nesting bee, and they're solitary. They show up sometime in early spring, or they'll show up in May or June or July. There's bees that show up in deep August. So these bees there's pollen out there. These bees were there in the first place. And you shift back 1,500 years ago, a lot of these bees were just nesting in old dead trees where someone pecked a hole into it. There was a bark beetle, and these bees would be in a hole for the year. The eggs were laid, the bees became adult bees, and then once they left, those old holes would deteriorate. So that's kind of what used to be. And we kind of fast forward into man's touch on what we've done. And this is the University of Vermont. A few years ago they did this, but the bees that are apses, you can probably see this is all kind of the soybean and corn arenas. It's a lot of agriculture, and then now kind of temper in what's happening with the climate change. And it's a mess. It's a tough thing. And it's what I find wonderful is that Wild Ones, cares about trying to bring in nature where it might have been missing. And so my company, similar to what I had done 30 years ago, is by replacing a dead tree with a bunch of small, medium, and large holes. Is this a replacement on a small area? So let's say this bee house probably works well for a couple houses. Can we provide habitat? But when we're starting to think through what actually happens in nature when this isn't natural. In an old dead tree, you'd have one hole over here and one hole over there, and pests wouldn't really move between them. And also, these holes would deteriorate. And all sorts of foodstuffs, whether it's pollen and nectar or larvae, there's a lot of little funguses and parasitic wasps and flies, and all these things also go into those same holes. And if you do nothing, if your holes aren't deteriorating every year or being replaced, then really it actually winds up being a bad thing. And so there's a lot of products since my company started. There's just they're typically built overseas, China or someplace. They're glued in where you can't take things out. They're drilled holes with blocks of wood. It's hard bamboo. This style of house, while fun and it sounds a good idea, actually winds up killing bees. And so there's some good and there's some not so good aspects of trying to help bring back populations of bees that can't nest there because their nesting holes aren't there. And so, we're trying to be as best we can. And I appreciate that Wild Ones is out there, and I appreciate this webinar. Thanks, Sarah. Appreciate it. Back to you.
Thank you, Dave. As always, you bring a very interesting perspective, so I appreciate your time today. So last but certainly not least, we welcome Lora Morandin, Associate Director of Pollinator Partnership, which is the largest organization dedicated exclusively to pollinator conservation. Lora has been researching bees and pollination since 1997. Her work focuses on understanding the intricate relationships between managed and wild pollinators, especially the roles honeybees and native bees play in our ecosystems. She brings a thoughtful perspective on balancing agricultural needs with biodiversity and conservation while creating habitats that support all pollinators. Lora.
Hey, well, thanks for having me here today. I'm going to talk about honeybees and how they fit into our world in North America and how they relate to pollination, food production, conservation, and native bees. A lot for 10 minutes, so it's going to be a broad overview. And I want this talk to potentially give you more information and perspective rather than all the answers, because we don't have all the answers. But what we do have is a situation that very often needs better understanding and more nuance in the conversation. So when most people think about bees, they think about these bees, the honeybees. But as Sam and Dave talked about, there's over 4,000 species of bees in North America. Honeybees get a lot of attention. So why is this? Okay, to give you some perspective, I'm going to start with a brief summary of the history of honeybees in North America. The honeybees that we have here today are not native to North America. They were brought to North America in 1622, about 400 years ago, mainly for the purpose of honey production. Colonies are kept in artificial hives, and numbers of hives, they've been increased by humans over those next few hundred years to now. And they've been moved to almost all locations across the continent. Colony numbers peaked around the end of World War II with about 5.9 million colonies in the U.S., and then after that, there were declines in the number of colonies because honey demand and prices fell. Since about the 1990s, the number of managed honeybee colonies in the U.S. is about 2.5 million. And contrary to what many of the public are hearing, the number of managed honeybee colonies in the U.S. has not declined. But what is happening is that there's increasing health issues that managed honeybees are facing. And this is resulting in unprecedented loss of colonies each year. And this makes it quite hard for honeybee keepers to maintain colony numbers and provide colonies at the right time for crop pollination services. But so far, they've managed to maintain numbers by splitting strong colonies and importing queens and importing small colonies. So currently, most large-scale beekeepers use their colonies for crop pollination and sometimes for honey production. Millions of colonies are moved to California in the early spring for almond production, then to the Pacific Northwest for pollination of many types of fruit and other crops, then to the Midwest and eastern parts of the country for crops like squash and apples, blueberries, and soybeans. And in between the crop pollination services, and towards the end of the season, honeybees can be kept more healthy if they're put in areas that have high diversity and abundance of floral resources. And this placement of colonies in floral diverse areas, particularly on public lands, resulting in increasing conflict and tensions between the beekeeping industry and conservationists. So the estimated contribution of honeybees in the U.S. for crop pollination is about $18 billion each year. Without honeybees, large-scale agriculture would have lower production, likely resulting in higher food prices. So as mentioned, honeybees are experiencing unprecedented yearly loss and health problems. But this is an agricultural issue and not a conservation issue per se. This is where the waters have gotten muddied at times in the conservation world and in the public in terms of how to help with food production, with bees, and with natural ecosystems. Many well-meaning people are trying to help with this pollination crisis by keeping honeybees. There can be a lot of reasons to be a beekeeper: to pollinate crops, to produce honey, which we can't get from native bees in the U.S., for other hive products, for education, or even for reasons like it being a fulfilling hobby. But it should be understood that honeybee keeping is not a conservation action. So I want to emphasize, honeybees are integral to our current agricultural production in the U.S., and they do need support, such as funding for research for better control of pests and diseases and improving stock. And they need places where they can access abundant and diverse floral resources in order to keep them healthy and reduce colony loss. Okay, now I want to touch on the issue of honeybees potentially causing negative impacts on native bees. This topic has been quite in some sectors. There's three main ways that honeybees could potentially negatively impact native bees. Through direct competition for nectar and pollen from flowers, through changes in floral communities, and by potentially transferring pests and diseases. So today, with not too much time, I'm just going to talk about direct competition for floral resources. And honeybees are widely thought to have a competitive advantage for floral resources over native bees for a few reasons. They have colonies with 20 to 40,000 foragers. They recruit their sisters to rewarding floral patches. They can forage on lots of different types of flowers. They store honey so they can get through periods of poor weather and through the winter. And they can forage at farther distances than most native bees. And additionally, they're managed by humans for the most part. So they're somewhat more protected from weather and parasites and diseases than wild bees. And hives can be moved to areas with good floral resources. These things that make them such good competitors are also the things that make them special, why we farm and manage them for crop pollination and for honey production, and why they're so ubiquitous and somewhat the ambassador bee familiar to almost everyone on the planet. So because these unique traits that honeybees have, if floral resources are limiting and there's high numbers of honeybees, there's concern that honeybees could negatively impact native bees and cause further declines in native bee populations. There's a growing number of studies on competition between managed honeybees and managed honeybees and wild bees. And I'll just briefly touch on a review of the science that we conducted. So we reviewed studies that met criteria of experimental manipulation and paired assessment of honeybee impact on wild bees. And 19 papers at that time satisfied our criteria. And the results showed that about half the studies found that there were negative impacts of honeybees on native bees, and about half found no indication of negative impact. So overall, studies to date are mixed and indicate there could potentially be harm from honeybees in some situations, but not others. And it's likely very context specific. So can we come up with something, let's say like a carrying capacity or other way to inform how many and where can we have honeybees and not significantly negatively impact native bees? We really aren't there with the science, and we may never be in all situations, since it's likely so different in each landscape for some of the reasons that I have listed here. And in addition, one person's idea of what significant negative impact is could be really different from another person's. Okay, so what can we do with this information? I think it makes sense to take a precautionary approach on where and how many honeybee hives we put in different locations, especially in areas that are important to native bee conservation. But we also need to get a better understanding of how honeybees might negatively impact native bees or not in different situations. And I suggest that we don't pit honeybees against other bees. So to me, that's like pitting food production against conservation. We need both in North America. We need food production, but we also want and need biodiversity and healthy ecosystems. We need those for their intrinsic value and because we're part of ecosystems and we rely on the services that they provide. So we try to find ways to integrate conservation into agricultural landscapes and make agriculture less impactful on the environment. And we reserve other areas for conservation. And similarly, honeybees are essential to our current agricultural production, and we need to support them as such, while finding ways to minimize impact to our natural world. And so one of the best ways to support both managed and wild bees, like Sam was saying and Dave was saying, is to preserve the habitat we have and create more habitat. By creating more habitat, we can potentially reduce the competition among bees for resources and support all pollinators. And this is going to help us have healthy ecosystems and help us better produce food and keep food prices down. We can put habitat into many different types of lands, but we need better outreach and education and policies and financial support for these actions in all sectors. In addition to directly adding habitat, there's lots of other ways to help pollinators. You can learn more about them and help raise awareness. You can reduce your own environmental footprint. You can vote with your dollars by buying from companies that support conservation. And you can support groups that do research and conserve pollinators. So at Pollinator Partnership, we've got lots of free resources for you, and we've got many different programs to help people support pollinators. So for instance, we have the eco-regional planting guides and the Find Your Roots tool, where you can make custom lists of native plants for your habitat project. If you'd like to have a more in-depth understanding of pollinators, the issues, and how to help, you can join our Pollinator Steward Certification Program. We have the BMD, which helps beekeepers diagnose and treat honeybee colony issues. And we have many volunteer and habitat installation programs that help with financial and technical support for creating pollinator habitat. And you can join us in celebrating Pollinator Week in June. So I do encourage you to check out the resources and programs on our website, and you can always reach out with any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lora, and thank you everyone for all your perspectives in these presentations. Lots to take in here. So let's transition into a discussion on the challenges and opportunities in pollinator conservation. So one of the key themes tonight is responsible management and practices. So what does that look like in practice, especially when you're looking at bee hobbyists, small-scale farmers, and homeowners?
I can start. So it is so situational, right? So in any of these kinds of situations, you're going to be constrained by something, whether it's cultural norms, homeowners association, farming practices, all these sorts of things. But the angle in almost all cases, because the conservation of bees is the conservation of flowers and the conservation of native flowers. So the angle almost in all situations will be, how can I bring in more native bloom into the things that I do? And what are those opportunities? And you have your own set of limits and your own set of constraints. But a lot of times it's like, hey, why am I mowing this back part of the field? Maybe I can let the ditches grow out a little bit more, that kind of thing.
And part of this, it's tough in our environment today where you have monoculture, where you've got thousands of acres of one plant, apples, almonds, canola. And when you look at that, it's trying to keep the cost of food down. And when you're doing this, you have, unfortunately, 2 weeks of bloom, and then you have a Sahara Desert for the rest of the year. So that's tough. And even what we see in farmlands across countries where you might be putting out pollinator strips, and farmers do this, but then after the bloom is done, they're out there spraying. And so any bee that might have been using these hedgerows are getting hit with sprays, and it's tough. There's no answer that I'm seeing out here today. On the homeowner side, we've learned that the bees that we work with, the cavity nesters, typically fly away at the smell of adverse chemicals. So we're always saying, well, your yard might be an oasis. Plant as many flowers as you can, but if you can also extend your little bubble of oasis to your neighbors, how do you talk with them about the bees in my yard are going to be pollinating your flowers? It's tough. And it takes probably, action through conversation to your local neighbors. Not easy.
Yeah, and I agree with all that. We need to manage our habitat, and we need to help manage bees. So many of our environments and our landscapes now are quite artificial. So what can we do to help support both food production in an economical way, but also our native biodiversity that is so important for so many reasons? And like Sam is saying, that there's some pretty easy entryways, and there's things that everybody can do. And if you do a Google search for a local native plant nursery and put a native plant or two into your yard, and then watch the different bees that come to it, you might see some bees that you never saw on your herbs and things that attract lots of bees, but maybe not diversity of bees. So trying to find those easy entry points. You don't have to do everything at once. These small actions can make a big difference for support of pollinators, both those managed pollinators, but importantly, of course, as well, the native pollinators.
If I could add to what Laura just said, we've learned that as you walk into a nursery and you find the bush or shrub that's buzzing, buy that. And even as you're walking around, look for it. You're going to have tiny little bees that will be focusing on some plant. Buy that. And so you're now gardening for a wildlife, not just for the human.
Thank you for all of that. Of course, let's talk success stories. Can you maybe share an example? I think we kind of covered a little bit of this, but I'd love to hear more about an example where just like a small change in management practices had a big impact on bee conservation.
There's so many of these circumstances, and it's not like some mystery. There was lawn, and then there were pollinator-friendly landscaping put in. Sometimes it's just not cutting the lawn, except maybe once a year, those kinds of things. So we see it over and over again in just homeowners' yards. Like if a homeowner really gets serious about their planting of native plants, even if it's just for the plants. So a lot of times I'll visit places and they're not bee people, let's call them. They're just people who have a sense that planting the native varieties are the right thing to do, right? They resonate with surrounding habitats and with themselves, and they feel good about planting that. But that yard will have all kinds, even if it's in the middle of the city, it's a build it, you will come sort of phenomena. That yard is full of all kinds of native plants. I mean, native bees, native plants and native bees. And so I'll just give one little additional story. So bees don't require much energy and much pollen to produce another bee. They're exothermic, so they're not having to produce heat themselves. So their energy bud is really low. So a super back of the envelope calculation is 5 flowers equals enough pollen and nectar for one baby bee. A big flower, think of a sunflower head. So sunflower head, there's enough pollen in there for 100 nests of baby bees, or cells, we would call them. So an impact can be as small as I'm putting something on I'm putting a large potted fill-in-the-blank blooming native plant on my deck or on my balcony in my apartment, and they'll find it up there. I think a study in Chicago said you had to go up 16 floors before bees couldn't get up there. So really, there's no excuse to not bring in even just one clump of something or other into the environment. So all these things add up, and further you get into working with counties and municipalities and groups that manage and look at and service large landscapes and move them out of the mow it several times a year because what the heck, that's what we're supposed to do, to carving out part of that and putting it into periodic mowings. Great impacts. We see it all the time. Not even surprising.
I had worked with a researcher analyzing bees out of organic farms, and the conclusion was the older the organic farm, the more bee species they had out there. These were cavity nesters from a 4 millimeter hole all the way up to like a 14. So just a variety of bees. But when we dug into that, we think it's because solitary bees all show up at a different time of the year, 6 or so weeks. And for that species to show up the following year, there's got to be food at that time for next year's bees to again nest. And so the older the organic farms, the more, and they're established farms, those pollinators kept on showing up in June or July or May. So they had, They had something to go there. So continuity of resources and then a place for these bees to nest was probably one of the bigger lessons I've seen.
Yeah, and I would say one of the big examples that I have of this that I think is a really good news story is during my postdoc work in the Central Valley of California, I was examining native plant hedgerows adjacent to crops and then comparing that to just what the standard is weedy edges adjacent to crops. And what I found was that there was more abundant bees in these native plant hedgerows. But the really big thing was that there was about 3 times more types of species in these native plant hedgerows than there were in these weedy edges. And you've got to keep in mind that these areas are agriculture. There is very little habitat, and really underscoring that principle of you build it and they will come. Even in these really areas where you might think it's sort of a desert for biodiversity and bees, we were seeing this diversity of bees come into these native plant hedgerows. So that was I think a really great success story. And another one that I worked on was at an airport garden at the Nanaimo Airport on Vancouver Island, and we took it from an ornamental garden, which was quite pretty and people liked, and they were concerned about turning it into a more native habitat. And we did this a few years back, and I've been monitoring the garden for about 4 years now since it was converted into a native plant pollinator habitat. And what we're seeing is there's over 100 times more bees in this native plant habitat than in the surrounding areas that are more ornamental type gardens. So there's still some ornamental gardens around the terminal, but they've got next to no bees. And the couple bees that I did see was either a honeybee or a bumblebee. Then this native plant garden is just buzzing with bees, and it's increased over the couple years or 3 years that I've been monitoring it. So those native bee populations take a little bit of time to build up, but they don't really take that long to build up, it's looking like.
Laura, what are you hearing? If I could just ask a question, Laura, what are you hearing with replacing lawn with clover? Is that a good practice?
It's going to be better than grass. There's floral resources in clover. There's lots of different types of clover. There's native clovers. There's non-native clovers. Often when people do use clover, they're thinking of maybe a non-native type. So it's going to help those generalist bees, those longer tongue bees, most likely, and a few types of bees. Better than having lawn. But then there's also, steps up you can take from that to add more diversity. So, we all don't need to put in 40 different types of native plants. If that's your entry point that you're comfortable with and putting in clover, it's not going to hurt. It's going to help.
I'll point out that, in the topic of how will bees find my very isolated patch of flowers and things like that. And it turns out they're superb dispersers. So we did a study in Washington, D.C., in the largest parking lot we could find, which was at Redskins Stadium. It was a mile on one axis, and it was not quite rectangular, but half a mile for most of the rest on the opposite axis. And there was not a crack in that whole thing. There were no medians. It was solid asphalt. And so we put up a grid of traps throughout the area, and I had a student that needed a project. I thought, well, this could be interesting. We'll see how far into the middle the bees, will wander, with the idea that the edges will have a lot and the middle will have none, because who would go out there? And then we sampled around the edges too, which had lots of weeds, lots of places that bees would be visiting under normal circumstances. And it turns out there was no pattern. There were just as many bees caught in the middle of that parking lot as elsewhere. And our take home, and we've seen this out west on Playa Lakes, which also have there's no plants out there. They're just all salt pans. And 5 miles out, same thing. You can put a trap out and bees get caught. So we have an island that was a dread spoil habitat. No bees, 2 kilometers from the nearest landfall, 100 species later. So the basic answer is that a bee comes out of its hole, whatever it is. It's not in communication with any other bees. It's not in communication. Mom and dad are dead. And what they do is they start looking. They look for the signal for their group of plants. And it's usually nearby, right? Because why would there be a nest otherwise? And if it's not, they start flying. And they don't have like, don't go fly over water, don't fly over cities or salt pans. They just start flying, looking for that signal, and they either find it or they're dead. So your yard, if it has it, just has this pretty good opportunity to hit some of these dispersing bees, which they have to do. And that's a natural part of it's not new. It's not like we force them to disperse, but it's just amazing what will show up in an area that is absent of seeming any kind of habitat, urban areas and all kinds of stuff. So we see that pattern all the time. It's not like that, we built this whole great garden. It's all filled with native plants. There's nothing there. It's never nothing. The bees find it almost immediately.
Thank you for sharing that. Really what I'm hearing is just the low barrier to entry here. Any small change you make really is going to make a difference for bees. And so thank you for sharing all of those great success stories. It's always good news when lots of ideas pop into your head when you're thinking of success when it comes to conservation here. So kind of our last discussion topic just surrounds advocacy. So if we could pick one policy or program that attendees could advocate for or conduct in their communities to support native pollinators, what would that be? Throw it to Lora this time. You can start.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I would say advocating for wildscaping and not having bylaws that restrict use of native plants. So we need to keep in mind aesthetics and that different people have different ideas of what gardens and lawns should look like, but there are definitely ways to incorporate wild plants, native plants, and wildscaping type practices in your yard, and it can look beautiful and not messy and not unkempt. So I would say that is one of the biggest things that I think could help pollinators, especially in urban environments.
I'm going to say education. That when you've got a space that's a community garden, you're going to have people going through there, and it's beautiful there. But to have signs that said, "This is this plant, and it's helpful for these bees. Go plant this at home," and by demonstrating on pathways or community gardens, by helping people see this is an example of solid pollinator habitat, I would hope that then people could learn and go try this at themselves. Here's a list of nurseries where you can get these things. It's trying to, you're trying to influence the influencers. And so you and I are reaching out to the community gardens to have words that someone can learn there and take home. And the only other piece, when I see the word pollinator habitat, to the humans, I could say our habitat is just Albertsons or Safeways because that's where food is. And then we got to realize, wait, pollinators have to live, 90% have to live within 300 yards of that food source. And so what is the ground? Is the ground full of chemicals? Do we have weed block? Are there bee habitats above ground that might have been old dead trees? So part of it is food. And the other part of it is to teach the bees have to live here. Can they? It's the awareness.
So I have to say, I am a one-trick pony. Stop mowing. I'm from the East, so we have a lot more things to mow. But if you look at, and I'm not talking, yes, the homeowners should be also thinking along these lines. They have own land. There's some place that doesn't need to be mown every single time, once a year in the winter. But look at when you drive around in the rural areas and even along major interstates, right? There is a need to mow several times a year the verges for safety reasons so a car can pull off in case of an accident. And then there's a need sometimes to have lines of sight so around a curve you can be aware of upcoming problems or traffic. But most of those rest of those areas, including the line of sight ones, are places that only need to be mown once a year in the winter when nothing is growing. And you're saving money. You're not polluting as much. You have created instant habitat. And it's really just habit. And you have these long-term contracts, right, that most counties are contributing. And so the idea is to work with the maintenance, the facilities, and the contractors, not where we do our sexy stuff, right? We're not out there doing pollinator gardens. Work with the municipalities and say, hey, we think this is very important and it has all these advantages. And oh, by the way, you're really going to be helping bees. And get in there, make some changes, make sure that the guy on the tractor and the brush hog understands, give them a lecture. Why the heck are we doing this? They like, it's a guy thing, right? They like mowing. They're like, oh, I'm going to mow up here because I'm on my $1 million tractor with cool and I can cut down anything. So they're going to do it. So there's so many opportunities to immediately have an impact. All right, I'm off my soapbox.
Just a safety note, don't pull off the highway and knock on the window of the lawnmower person. So I like it. Thank you, Sam. I think here's a good entry point, I think, for a discussion about community science programs as well. I know a lot of you are involved directly in research, but how can individuals or community members really participate in providing data to conservation birds? Sam, you're the natural go-to, I think, on that for.
I would point to the people who are doing good pollinator things mediated by what they're doing with plants. So, Pollinator Partnership, Xerxes, Wild Ones, all of you guys, and many more local, Bee City. These are all places that have huge impacts that are not necessarily in an in-depth understanding of all the bee biology that we on the talk here love, and species accounts and things like that. But it's okay because the plants and restoring and bringing back in and reflecting the surrounding habitats and native areas and understanding about management of existing landscapes, removal of deer, removal of invasive species, and promoting the natural components are going to be highly impactful, and it doesn't have to be nuanced, right? So you don't have to know all these lovely details. It's just managing for natural systems, and you're doing good. And every once in a while, one of us might pop up and say, well, maybe shift some of that this direction and these sandy habitats or whatever.
I'm going to say that I'm an advocate of iNaturalist, that the more people that learn this awesome little app that you're just holding up on your phone and taking pictures of something, I think the more we are aware of this across the country, the more data people or scientists are able to gain. You don't have to have a researcher trapping everywhere. The backyard gardener is creating that awareness as well. That would be one piece. And then still I would lean back into thinking through the cavity nesters and helping people move these around within a tight area might just maybe expand the pollinator spread as a thought.
Yeah, and in terms of community science, it is just so important, and it's growing. And with the increase in technology, we're getting better and better identification and better data tracking. So it is quite valuable to scientists. We do use iNaturalist quite extensively, so you can look up the Pollinator Partnership projects on there, and we have year-long projects, and we have a Pollinator Week Bio Blitz that's really fun and growing, so you can get into iNaturalist and do that. And then in terms of engaging communities and spreading knowledge, I really agree that we need this grassroots spread of knowledge. And that's the reason that we offer this Pollinator Steward certification training, because we want to train the trainers. We want to train people all over the place then to spread the word and get this out there. What can you do to help pollinators? So I think there's a lot of different angles that we can come this from in terms of collecting data and in terms of spreading the word. And we really need to have this all hands on deck and really spread the word and get data in different ways and educate people in many different ways in many different sectors.
Thank you. Thank you for that insight. I appreciate it. So switching gears here, we've received hundreds of questions from registrants ahead of this webinar already, and I am sure that the live chat is just buzzing with questions. So for the sake of time, I think I'm just going to go over one of those questions, unfortunately. And here it is from Sally J. She asks, I've heard mixed opinions on insect hotels. So what are the risks and benefits, and what should people consider before installing one? And so I'll toss that to Dave to start, because that makes sense there.
Back in the day, if you had an old dead tree or a broken reed, these holes were used 1 year. The bees nested in there. The following year, the bees emerged, and those holes were deteriorating. So this is how I'm going to say the bees have evolved to work with that type of environment. When you bring in these man-made shelters that now protect these holes, you're allowing the holes to stay in place for, years. And as a result, this pile of awesome food resources, pollen and nectar and bee larvae, all of these things attract nature to it. And so if you just place something out there, drill blocks of wood, something bamboo that you bought some from Costco or Amazon or whatever, I believe over time, these things kill more bees than you were doing good, just because the following year, the pests are left in there, the bees have left. The pests are in there, and now the bees don't know any difference because they've evolved to just go into a brand new hole. So here's an old hole filled with pests. And so over a period of time, it's mostly just pests that are there. So what we advocate to our followers is always be supplying clean holes every year, so nothing's glued in, no bamboo, no drill blocks. And it's a small management that really is, there's easy practices, but pull things out, put fresh ones out there, allowing the bees that were in there to emerge and reuse these new ones. I would only lean into that path versus, I'm calling them death traps. So it's a valid question. It's just the market is inundated with pieces of stuff from across the planet that just get here because people are making money and they don't care about the bees that are in there.
Thanks, Dave.
I'll add to what. So
Sam.
Lora, you go. I talk too much.
No, not at all, Sam. I love hearing you talk. So we do advocate for natural habitat over putting in bee boxes, bee hotels, bee homes. They're called many different things because of many of those reasons that Dave said. They really need to be done properly in order for them to be effective. So the biggest thing is they need to be able to be cleaned. Once you put organisms or invite them into an artificial setting, you become a farmer. You can't leave cows in a barn and not clean it out. You become a farmer. You need to keep that environment clean at that point. So we're against it necessarily, but it needs to be done properly. And I think it's really important that people understand what they're doing. They're not necessarily supporting conservation by putting out these bee boxes. Maybe there's an orchard they want to pollinate and it's not going to get enough early spring pollinators. So that makes a lot of sense. Or the biggest one I see these bee homes for is for education. I think they can be an amazing education and outreach tool and get people into the world of bees. And it can really help people understand bees better. If you get these peekaboo ones, you can even open them up during different development and see the bees developing in there, which is really, really cool. And it can help people understand that bees are not coming out to sting you. So you can stand right by these bee boxes. They're going to be going right around you, not bothering you. You're not bothering them. So I think there is a really great educational component, but I think people need to understand what bee boxes are and what they're not. And they need to do it with a bit of education. Dave has a ton of good videos on his site. We've got about a 20-minute video, a free video on our site about what to do and what not to do with bee boxes, what they are and what they're not. So I encourage people to go look at those resources.
Let me follow up with both. So I always tell people, if you get some kind of bee box of any kind, don't put it in the back, put it next to your kitchen window, right? You want to see the action. Most of the good here is learning about bees, seeing them in action. They're not stinging, as Lora said, and that's what you want. You want to show people, you want to see the day-to-day and be able to talk about it, and then that has a good spread. My neighbor in her 80s, every year I have to get her a new bee box, and she likes to sit on her porch, and literally right next to her is a table, and we put 2 or 3 4x4s on there filled with holes, and she loves it. They just are coming and going. It's not a stinging issue, right? So she just really enjoys the show. So that's a good one. The other, as Dave mentioned something about natural wood, leaving those kinds of things. I'll just make a point that there are quite a number of bees that nest in rotting wood. So if you're taking down a tree, just leave whatever, big chunks of wood on the ground. It doesn't look like much, but there's a whole community of bees and many other insects that are using that. And then think about what we have, which is a general neat and tidy culture. Like, oh, I have 5 acres. Well, you give a guy 5 acres and he's going to mess up all 5 acres. He's going to be like, well, we need more lawn and we need to clean out all that brush in there. And so what you end up with is a few scattered trees and nothing else. So the functionality of these natural communities, again, I'm an Easterner, so I have a lot of forest kind of thinking going on here. The functionality is to leave natural environments and not try to neaten them up. That's kind of antithetical to the whole thing. So it can be a lot of different things. And again, you don't have to overthink it. But if you're thinking like, I just got to clear out that understory because there's so much shrubs and other junky looking things, and maybe I'll go in there and mow it and break up all the leaves. Don't do that. I'll stop.
That makes this thing. That just aren't bee hotels. When we're saying in an insect hotel, there's a lot of solitary beneficial wasps that are grabbing katydids and aphids and meat things to put in there, lay their eggs. And so you're adding biodiversity by doing this. But again, cleaning these things up. So it's just not bees. You're also bringing in wasps. They're good.
Thank you for sharing your perspectives on this. Of course, yeah, native habitat, leaving leaving brush piles, leaving dead trees is always first, but it's just very interesting to think about the idea of supplemental habitat like these insect hotels, bird baths, things like that. And so I'm glad, Lora, you touched on the educational value of these because Dave, you talked a little bit ago about getting science and telling you, hey, this is a great plan. And so all of that goes into just the engagement of passersby into your garden, bringing them in, educating them so they can then go on and plant a flower that will help a bee or something and so forth. So thanks for that discussion. That was very interesting. So as we wrap up tonight, I want to leave our audience with something actionable. We have lots of great discussion points here that I think folks can take away, but we have a few more minutes here to just list one key action, big or small, that attendees can do to better support pollinators in their own communities. And I will throw it to Lora.
Yeah, I would say check out our eco-regional guides and look at the big list of plants in there and go to a local native plant nursery and pick up one plant and plant it in your existing garden bed, plant it in a pot on your balcony, plant it in your community garden, and just start there. Plant a plant and watch it, see what happens, and go bigger from there, or if you like, get more education on this, look into the other resources. But I think that's really one of the first steps.
Go ahead, Dave. I know you're itching to share.
So ditto. But I would add, if you go out to a wild space and you just look at that and you say, well, where's nature's chemicals to make this thing work? And you realize it just works. You don't need to have chemicals to beautify, to add fertilizer, etc. I think the more native plantings you put in there, that your soil is probably going to come out healthy. And try not to put anything in a yard other than water. I mean, I'm not saying nothing, but be careful with the chemicals because bees will fly away from that. And it's, I think we're being told to put things out there, chemicals out there, because people are trying to make money off us. So not saying don't do it, but be careful. Maybe do far less.
Okay, well, I think we all need to inspect our lives. So let's not piddle around with small things. Think about your life, what you're doing, and you now have this very simple model. If there's more flowers in the world, there's going to be more bees. Don't overthink it, but do think as you go through the day and you making decisions, how am I increasing the number of those flowers? And then the obverse, how am I decreasing the number of flowers? Am I taking an environment and dumbing it down and decreasing its usefulness for pollinators by my actions? Think of your lawnmower. That's all I'm going to say.
Appreciate all those perspectives. It's a simple, shift, right? A mindset, an advocacy effort, a plant in the ground that can really make a meaningful difference. And so today, I hope that our folks watching can really, just take that one step, anything that we just discussed now to make a big difference. So as we wrap up here, thank you to our panelists for all of their insights and everyone that has joined us. If you have enjoyed this discussion, do stay tuned for future Wild Ones webinars. And don't forget, a healthy planet starts with native plants and you. So let's grow healthier landscapes, support pollinators, and build a future where native plants and natural landscapes flourish in every community. Bye-bye.